Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our World Water Week session on AI in groundwater management optimization. I am Mike Gardner. I am with the Kayaks, and with me also is Emery Coppola with NOAA Global Solutions. We are the co-conveners of this session. And I'm happy to present two additional panelists. The third panelist, unfortunately, due to personal circumstances, is not able to join us. So Dr. Suna Cinar will not be able to present. But who we do have now is we have Wesley Massoll with the Mojave Water Agency, and we have Manuel Sapiano with the Malta Energy and Water Agency. And let me just take a moment to introduce them. Um, Let me just take a moment to let each of them just very momentarily introduce themselves. We do have a very tight agenda, so we'll be moving very quickly through this session, basically. But Manuel, Wesley, and Emery, would you please just take a moment to introduce yourselves, please?
Sure, I'll go first. I'm Wesley Massoll, and I'm a principal hydrogeologist at the Mojave Water Agency.
So I continue, Manuel Sapiano, Chief Executive Officer of the Energy and Water Agency of Malta, by background a hydrogeologist.
My name is Emery Coppola. I'm the president of NOAA Global Solutions, and I'm also a hydrogeologist.
Thank you. And as we go through the sessions, we'll be talking about the different agencies in more detail and what they do. And what we are presenting today are three case studies in the use of AI in groundwater management. We'll be looking at salinity management and electricity optimization in Malta. We'll be looking at pollution plume transport in honestly a very horrible situation that had occurred in Toms River, New Jersey. And we'll be looking at electricity optimization and AI applications that the Mojave Water Agency is exploring here in California. Um, we wanted, though, to start off with just a very quick introduction to AI and clarifying a few things. AI today is relatively difficult to understand. The technology is moving very quickly, but the terminology is moving even more quickly, and there is a plethora. There are too many different trends that apply and that I think are confusing people about things. And we wanted to just kind of present a taxonomy of how to think about the AI that we're talking about. AI written large is quite a large field. There's a lot happening within it in technology and actually has been for quite a while. Starting back in the early 1980s, there was scientific research on what is now being called neural net-based AI. And neural nets were a type of construct using advanced mathematical techniques to construct a node of networks. And when you aggregate these nodes together, you get these amazing results. That research from the early 1980s has now branched into two main branches of neural net-based AI. The first one is what we think of as generative AI. And so if you have been using ChatGPT or another one of the generative AI chat solutions, or what we think of as AI, they are a derived branch of this research, and it's quite exciting what's happening there. But the AI that we're talking about now is comparable to that, but it's a different branch from the same research, and it is being called artificial neural networks, or ANNs, basically. And they are also quite powerful. They are quite useful for what we could call enterprise AI, where you're training on custom data. And additionally, we just want to make the point that AI can have many, many, many benefits. But it does require a lot of data preconditions. You're not going to get very far in AI unless you have set up the data in the right way. It turns out that poor data availability impedes nearly 90% of all data and projects, data science, and AI. it causes failure in a high degree of those projects, basically. And so if all the data that is needed for training the models is available and for running the models, then that's all great. But usually these data sets need to be cleansed or cleaned or prepared, and they also need to be assembled. And so that is something to consider as you think about the possibilities of your organization moving into AI. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Emery Coppola. He's going to be talking in a bit more detail about how NOAA's AI works, just as an example of AI for a few minutes. And then we're going to be moving straight into the case studies. So Emery, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, AI with neural networks, artificial neural networks has been around for decades. It went through different periods of a renaissance and a dark age because of data limitations and perhaps perception, but it's an extremely powerful mathematical method. In fact, it's so powerful that it's the first computational method to ever be awarded a Nobel Prize in physics, which happened last year. And AI can be used not just in its own way in terms of making predictions that are very insightful, even better understand your system itself, but also you can combine it with other advanced methodologies like formal optimization, which we'll quickly overview the next couple slides. Next slide, please. So the system that we developed way back in the dark age, I would say, is we take neural networks or artificial neural networks, and as Mike said, a critical element is combining the right data. We're trying to assimilate the data. And once you've assimilated that data based on your understanding of the physical system and what the objectives of not only the prediction, but the management objectives are, and you can then develop very accurate artificial neural network models that can predict real-time conditions, which we will describe later in this presentation. Now, it's very powerful to obviously have very accurate predictions, but then the question becomes, what do we do with those predictions? What we've done is combine the artificial neural network predictive capability with formal optimization. And optimization, a branch of science or mathematical computational science, where you can specify certain objectives that you would like to achieve and optimize around those objectives and constraints. So this is a neural network structure. You can see, as Mike mentioned, it's a series of nodes that are interconnected across layers. Essentially, the inputs or the variables you're using to make the predictions of interest, which is represented by the output layer. When you give it a training data set, it processes the data through its architecture of interconnected nodes, and it minimizes the prediction error. It minimizes the difference between what it predicts and what the actual values are. And it's a very powerful, very flexible, very adaptable computational method that can do really amazing things with very complicated data sets. Next slide, please. So decision-making optimization is this branch of mathematics that was actually awarded a Nobel Prize for linear programming and then later for multi-objective optimization, where you can formulate your management problem in terms of objectives and constraints. So the common objective might be, I want to minimize my energy costs, or I want to maximize my water supply, but there is always certain constraints on your system. So common constraints are how much water demand you need to meet, water quality constraints. You don't want to pump water that might be contaminated or might have excessive levels of, let's say, naturally occurring elements like arsenic, for example. That's an extreme example. That's the real example. And then what you do is you can take your neural network model, combine it within this optimization model, and that would actually serve as part of your constraint set. One very powerful element of optimization is you can do what's called multi-objective optimization, where you can simultaneously optimize more than one objective. And often they can be conflicting objectives. And that's something we'll present later in the presentation. And then lastly, you can use different decision-making methods like game theory and multi-objective analysis, where you identify what is the best trade-off among my conflicting objectives within my constraint set. Next slide. So what we've done is combine the power of artificial neural networks for superior prediction capability with that of optimization. And neural networks have a very rich theoretical history, and also they've been proven, obviously, in many real-world applications. As Mike mentioned, the issue is you always want to try and collect the right data and use the right data for the problem you're trying to make the predictions for. Optimization, again, is also a very powerful method that can work independent of artificial neural networks or with them in combination. They can help you identify optimal trade-off solutions between conflicting objectives and give you very powerful insights into your management decisions. Next slide.
And with that, we're going to be turning to the case studies. And first up, Dr. Manuel Sapiano, the CEO of the Malta Energy and Water Agency, is going to be describing the Malta water situation to us. And then we'll turn back to Emery, who will talk about the AI work that was done to help with those challenges. Manuel.
Thanks, Michael, and good day to all. So, I think first thing which I would like to start with is actually introduce Malta. So Malta is a small island in the center of the Mediterranean. It has a Mediterranean climate, obviously, long hot summers, short cold and mildly wet winters. Precipitation is low, and it is actually, with climate change, getting lower year after year. Compounded with, let's say, these natural conditions of low water availability, Malta is also the most densely populated EU member state in the European Union and one of the top 10 in the world. And our population density exceeds the 3,000 persons per square kilometer. And therefore, we have a low availability, high water demand, an increasing population, particularly due to economic migration, which is also increasing water demand. The island is small. There's no rivers, no lakes, so no surface waters, and our only natural freshwater resources are our groundwater resources, carbonate limestone aquifers in direct lateral and vertical contact with the sea. So abstraction is makes the aquifers prone to seawater intrusion. High demands meant that over the years, over the last decades, there was systematic over-abstraction, which resulted into desalinization or the increased salinization of the groundwater systems. Back in the 1980s, we turned to desalination of seawater, which was a lifeline for the country because it managed to desalination helped us to meet sustainably and continuously water demand and therefore ensure water supply security. But desalination also comes with its costs, particularly in relation to electricity, because around 70% of the costs of producing water by desalination are the costs of electricity. Next slide, please. So, with let's say with an increasing population and increased demands, we had to increase desalinated water production, and today over 60% of our drinking water is produced by desalination plants. So there's a mix between groundwater from these deep-lying freshwater lenses, a typical hydrogeologically speaking Geigen-Herzberg lens. Water is pumped from it. It's a bit saline because the aquifer has suffered over abstraction over the last decades, but also because there's direct contact with seawater. So this water is blended in distribution reservoirs with water produced from desalination plants. The water quality varies by different sources, so we do have different reactions at different abstraction points. And these multiple sources blend into reservoirs where the main interest is maintaining the quality of the water, which is then distributed to people. Obviously, reverse osmosis plants will have low desalination. Groundwater will have a higher desalinated salinity content, but then in the blending, you need to keep into consideration several parameters, for example, including boron, which is typically high from RO plants, but low from groundwater. And therefore, this blending is important because it also guarantees the quality of the water. Next slide, please. So in this exercise, we're looking at one of the major groundwater abstraction stations, Takandia. It's in the center of the island, and And as you can see in the schematic of the aquifer system, the freshwater lens, this is a gallery, almost 1 kilometer long galleries, 100 meters below the ground surface, and they try to skim the freshwater lens. So it's a place from where a lot of groundwater is abstracted. And we've seen over the years that chloride concentrations vary depending on seasonal conditions. So the abstraction which is going on by the private sector, including agriculture, around the pumping station, weather conditions, and also the volumes which are pumped out from the pumping station itself. And therefore, we were trying to use this methodology, let's say neural network methodology, to try to develop a function which could predict the value or the quality of the blend of the groundwater desalinated water blend, and try to optimize not just in view of quality but also in view of other parameters, for example energy consumption, because we do know that with desalination your water and energy link becomes much more important, and therefore we're trying to develop this function to try to optimize water production, protecting groundwater, but also trying to be as sustainable and environmental friendly as possible. Next slide, and I believe I'll pass over to Emery once more.
Thank you, Manuel. That was an excellent overview. So as Manuel described, you have two major water sources they're trying to use for providing the supply necessary for this very densely populated country. It's both desalination of Mediterranean seawater and groundwater. Now, while groundwater is much cheaper to extract from an energy consumption perspective, it also has, like Manuel described, the vulnerability to saltwater upconing and intrusion. The reverse osmosis, in contrast, that is obviously much more expensive, but you can treat the water to the applicable standards. You're not exposing your groundwater system to more saltwater desalination by overpumping and pulling the Mediterranean seawater into your aquifer. So as Manuel described, we developed an artificial neural network to predict very accurately what the concentrations would be at the gallery in response to not just the pumping in the gallery, but also pumping of neighboring wells. In addition, we also had to predict other variables. So we also predicted water demand, for example, as that was part of our optimization constraint set. We then combined our different prediction models within this optimization management model, and we delineate what's called a trade-off solution among three different objectives. The three objectives were we wanted to balance energy consumption with protecting the groundwater system from saltwater intrusion and upconing, with maximizing the extent possible the final blended water quality between these two water sources. Next slide. So the idea of this, what the agency wanted to embark on, and credit to them, they embarked on this years before AI became the mainstay that it is today. So Manuel and his agency are really to be applauded for their forward thinking and their openness to innovation. And the idea is to develop this real-time optimal water production decision-making tool. We have data streaming into the models in real time. They can be making predictions, for example, related to water quality from pumping, to water demand needs based on weather conditions, to what will be the blended water quality if you mix the groundwater with reverse osmosis in certain proportions. And these models are then integrated with the optimization model that then provide them with real-time optimal decision-making capabilities so they can optimize a system as conditions change. So for example, if there's a real need for reduced energy consumption, they can then cut back on the reverse osmosis and pump the groundwater system more so to reduce energy load. This is the prediction that we did for that gallery that Manuel described. And again, it's a very complicated hydrogeologic system. Numerical models would be very difficult, if not impossible, to come close to what a neural network could predict in real time with this type of system. The next slide. So you can see, I mean, this is a very quick overview, but on the left slide, that shows there's really no relationship, as Manuel briefly described, between what the gallery is actually pumping and what the chloride concentrations are within the gallery. And that's simply because there's other competing pumping wells very close to this operating gallery or within, a distance where they're hydraulically affecting the system. So you basically have all these different pumping wells that are simultaneously operating at different rates, and that's introducing this very almost seemingly random behavior in how the chloride concentrations are at the gallery at any given moment in time. Well, using an artificial neural network, you take into account all the different pumping sources that are near this gallery within a certain distance of the gallery, in conjunction with weather conditions and other variables. We're able to very accurately predict what the chloride concentrations would be at the gallery in a particular month in time, which is a very powerful tool because then you can then optimize around those chloride conditions within the gallery itself. Next slide. So essentially, some of the outcomes were able to develop a very accurate prediction model for chloride concentrations at the gallery. We're able to consequently, using other models, predict what the saltwater upconing potential would be for not just the gallery, but 55 other production wells that the agency runs. We were also able to forecast water demand accurately, and then combining all these models together, we then optimize not only their energy cost, but also optimize the risk to the groundwater system from over pumping during certain periods of time that can then exacerbate the saltwater upcoming. Next slide. And these are a couple of links. So Manuel and the agency gave a really outstanding testimony about the project itself, and you can find it this YouTube linked. And then we also have something on our website, and there's articles you can find online about the project itself. And we believe it's a very, it's a really seminal project in Europe and actually for the world itself that we're aware of. It really was very pioneering. So the basis of where,
Emery,
yes,
maybe I can just make a few comments. Excuse me. So that's a great case study. We are now turning to talk about a case in New Jersey in the United States, a case of a horrible pollution, which Emery will be describing. As I had mentioned at the beginning of the session, unfortunately, Dr. Cinar is not able to join us today due to a personal circumstance, and Emery is going to be covering her presentation talking about Tom's River. I also just want to say that we're trying very hard to keep on schedule so that we can keep about 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So if you do have any questions as we go, please be saving those, and we'll be trying very hard for time at the end for those. And now, Emery, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. So Tom's River is a cautionary tale about public supply well fields that are often exposed to groundwater contamination plumes. And even though there are regulations that address these types of contaminants, there often are contaminants that may not be regulated at the time that are actually in the water supply system that people may not be aware of that can cause somewhat devastating impacts. And that unfortunately happened in Tom's River. And it was a project worked on many years ago. And actually, it's not often you work on a project that becomes a subject of a Pulitzer Prize winning book called Tom's River, which gives you insights into many of the missteps that happened. So the next slide, please. So this was the project where they were running a numerical groundwater flow model, the New Jersey Geological Survey. And the challenge was to try and optimize the pumping of the public supply wells that were providing water to the community. And the issue they were facing was during like peak tourist season, the demand doubles in the community, and they have to pump those wells more than they would often want to, particularly with the vulnerability of these wells to the groundwater contamination plume. And if they pumped the wells too much, they would see they were pulling some of the plume into the wells. They were treating the water to save drinking water standards, but there was a history of contaminants that were in the public supply well field that were not regulated and that the community was actually exposed to. And that, in fact, was suspected to have caused a higher than expected incidence of leukemia in young girls. So we were asked to try and take their numerical groundwater flow model and develop an optimization tool that would allow them to trade off the need between sustaining or achieving the water supply needed for the community while minimizing the risk to the wells that are pumping near this groundwater contamination plume. Next slide. And again, this is a very high demand community in the summer season. It's on the Atlantic coastline in New Jersey, has a large boardwalk, etc. If you look at the map to the left, again, it shows the flow line. So as these wells pump more, they have a higher tendency to pull the plume into the wells. And I should mention, this is the first project of its kind in terms of trying to use artificial neural networks to optimize a public supply well field. Next slide. This shows you a numerical model grid for the area. So for those of you who don't typically use numerical models or run groundwater flow models, basically numerical models was the standard for doing advanced predictions or used in weather prediction and engineering analysis, everything. The power of numerical models, you can discretize your study area into these little cells or grids. Within each cell, you can assign very unique parameters to each. For example, what is the thickness of the groundwater aquifer there? What is the conductive conditions of the aquifer? You can assign wells within each cell. You can even assign contaminant concentrations within your study area that are based on what you actually seen in the field. So they're very powerful for simulating complex systems. The problem is they're very numerically, computationally intensive, and they also cannot be initialized to real-time conditions. So for example, if you had, let's say, an extreme rainfall event and the water levels rose dramatically in your groundwater system, which would affect the dynamics of the flow and the vulnerability of the wells to the contamination, you cannot initialize your numerical model for those conditions. Next slide. So what our hypothesis was, we could take groundwater data from this numerical model and generate a very accurate prediction tool using artificial neural networks. So we ran many simulations with the numerical model. We saved those simulations, and we saved with those simulations what the pumping rates were of the wells, what the water levels were of the wells, and what the resulting water levels were at the end of certain stress periods, monthly stress periods. We trained the neural network to learn that behavior. So instead of having a model that consisted of 80,000 equations, we were making predictions at only select locations along that boundary where the wells could be vulnerable to the contamination. And we reduced it to about 60 equations, which is orders of magnitude faster and more efficient. The next slide. Next slide, please. So this just shows you how well the neural network did in learning the behavior of the numerical model. ModFlow is what's a very widespread model that was developed by the United States Geological Survey that's used worldwide. And you can see that regardless of the different pumping conditions over time, the neural network was almost exactly replicating what the numerical model was predicting would be the groundwater elevations based on weather and also pumping rates of the supply wells. And they're also pumping some of the water back into the groundwater system. So it was a relatively complicated hydraulic system. And yet the neural network was very accurately able to reproduce what the groundwater elevations would be. In fact, we looked at, it was off by, I think, 0.04 feet on average. It didn't matter whether you had extreme change or small change. It was very, very accurate. And we were trying to predict whether the well would be vulnerable to the contamination or not at a particular moment in time. It was accurate 96% of the time in accurately predicting whether it would be or would not. Next slide. So what we did was we took different decision-making methodologies, and there were three stakeholders in this problem. There was the water utility that wants and needs to provide water to the community. There was a chemical company who was responsible for the contamination that was dumped at an old farm site that contaminated the aquifer. And there was also the community itself. Now, the water utility wanted to provide the water as much as they could within the parameters of the safe drinking water standards would allow them to do. So their bias was to provide more water within those constraints. The community wanted to minimize the risk of drinking any water that might be contaminated. So they were biased more towards, they were risk adverse. We don't want to pump the wells more than we absolutely have to. And they would try to minimize the actual amount of pumping of the wells to try and minimize that risk. And the company whose waste was the source of the contamination, they obviously didn't want a lawsuit from either party. So they were kind of in the middle, but they were more biased towards minimizing the vulnerability of the wells because obviously they were concerned about the health risks. So we did this multi-objective analysis. We had the input from the different decision makers, and we came up with a solution that was actually really ideal in that it was able to pump the wells to the maximum extent possible while not drawing the contamination into the wells. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that the state actually concluded they had run mod flow many hundreds of times to try and come with an optimal pumping strategy to try and minimize the vulnerability of the wells while still meeting the demand for the community. And they concluded that our optimization actually provided them with a better solution because it provided them almost the maximum amount of water that you could provide while minimizing the vulnerability of the wells to nearby pollution. And this is an example of not only optimization, but conflict resolution, because you're trying to resolve the different priorities and objectives of different stakeholders that are involved in an extremely contentious case that really resulted in, hundreds of millions of dollars were actually spent on remediating the aquifer and in lawsuits. And of course, the worst thing is the leukemia they believe was caused by the contamination. That's it.
Thank you, Emery. And now we're turning to our final case study, which is with the Mojave Water Agency, and Wesley Massoll of the Mojave Agency is going to be presenting on what the Mojave situation is, what their operations look like, and what their challenges are. So Wesley, over to you, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike and Emery. So, just a little introduction to the Mojave Water Agency. We have a massive service area that's located in the Mojave Desert region of Southern California. So, it's about 4,900 square miles, and it's desert, very dry, and it is kind of built along a natural system of a river that has significant floods. About every 8 to 10 years, and that's the local naturally occurring groundwater supply that supports all of the communities in our service area. So as an agency, we're an enabling condition for the economic growth and support for those communities on the water supply side. So we have access to the state water project system in California, which transports water where there's surplus in Northern California down to these drier regions in Southern California via the California Aqueduct. And depending on the year and the conditions, we are delivering to the ground between 12 and 100,000 acre feet, which is the US unit for water, but about 125,000 megaliters is about 100,000 acre feet. So we have a complex system, and then within that, we have a small direct potable use program which recovers stored groundwater, delivers it to one small subset of farmers and some of the cities that you can see on the map, the Adelanto, Victorville, Hesperia area that take actual potable water from us. So next slide, please. So because the agency is in the desert region, which is disadvantaged communities, relatively poor, one of the core tenets of the agency is to maximize the return on investment for these communities. And a significant part of that is related directly to the decisions that the agency makes about when to run our wells and what the energy costs of that and for how long, and when to import water and under what market conditions are we purchasing water from the state and delivering it to different portions of the service area. And then the other thing that we do is we work with our communities to understand what their wants, needs, and problems are. And then we see if we have the skill sets and the tools available to help them manage some of their localized groundwater management problems. There's a few well fields that are sandwiched in between some contaminant plumes similar to the Toms River issue, and we are in the process of reaching out to those communities and seeing what they need from us. And so the bigger picture vision for Mojave is to create a set of decision support tools that are powered by AI to help us go on to the community and provide real-time solutions for these people. So yeah, that's kind of the bigger picture where we're facing the same changing climatic norms, variability in our supply that everyone else is, and we're trying to make the best decisions at the least cost that we can for the people that rely on us. So yeah, so next slide. So we have our water delivery system, which is called the Regional Recharge and Recovery System, or R-Cubed, and it's 6 groundwater wells and a supply reservoir with a total capacity of about 2.5 million gallons. It has a booster pump station that moves water from Reservoir 1 to our second reservoir. And then there's several turnouts along that system that are delivering to the different cities and small water systems. And because of the kind of unique hydrogeology of the system, this water is only treated with chlorine before it meets the drinking water standards. So there's one small water treatment site that it goes to that chlorinates the water, and that's delivered directly to the small water systems, then delivered directly to people's houses. So one of the issues, though, is that this system serves some very disadvantaged communities, and the small water systems that are taking our water and delivering it to the people are extremely cost conscious. And so how and when we operate the booster station and the pumps has a significant impact on the cost of the delivery of this water. So as a kind of a pilot project or a proof of concept for AI, we've been working with Emory to see if we can meet our customer demands at the lowest cost through this system. So next slide. So this is a graphical overview of the system. You can see turnout 7 up at the top left is the one that meets our agricultural customers. Then the rest of them, those are direct to people's houses, essentially. So that's the physical system. There's the well field, which is 6 really high capacity wells. They pump about 3,500 gallons per minute to deliver water into the pipeline through the pump stations and into the reservoirs that are then emptied into the turnouts. So next slide. So yeah, Emory, did you want to take it from here, or do you want me to keep going?
I do this slide too, since you're the
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I kind of touched on this already, but we're looking to minimize the energy costs around our pumping in this system, and while also maintaining that 100% reliability target for these people. And so we're pairing an AI-driven water demand, an energy forecasting model with an optimization model so that our pump scheduling and storage management meets those low-cost priorities. So thank you.
so is so as described, this is a very water scarce area, but they do have a very plentiful groundwater system. In terms of those yields are amazing. 3,500 gallons per minute is not your typical production well, I can tell you that. I think Manuel can speak to that, and Mike, and it's very rare. But the problem with that is that you do have a lot of competition between those wells in terms of when they pump, they can be in effect competing against each other in terms of increasing energy costs. And I'll describe that a little bit more in detail. But essentially, as was described by Wesley, you have a number of production wells are trying to optimize their pumping rates and reduce energy consumption while trying to meet an uncertain demand for the system, which can vary as maybe a function of weather and other conditions as well. Next slide. So, what are some of the management parameters that a system like this would have? Well, obviously, you want to maintain. They use 2 reservoirs to help store water for the system, so they're not just operating the wells to meet the demand, but also using some of the what's in supply within those reservoirs. So you want to maintain those reservoirs within at least a minimum level, not just to meet demand requirements, but also to offset energy costs. And obviously, there's a maximum that any of those reservoirs can hold. So that's the upper constraint. Then you have what are the minimum maximum pumping rates of the well. So the minimum of any well is going to be 0, of course. The maximum can vary, but you're saying generally around 3,500 gallons per minute, but that's something that the optimization model needs to have and know. And the thing that's very dynamic and be uncertain is the water demand. And we're looking into that data with kayaks, with Mike, and with Wesley, with Mojave, to look if we see patterns based on what the farmers are using to supplement their own water use because they have their own production wells. But at certain times of the year or maybe the season, they have to turn to the system to supplement what they have. When we're trying to optimize in this particular case are the energy costs. And what makes it a little more complicated is the energy costs vary as a function of time. So they have different what they call peak times they look at that they basically decide at the beginning of the year what would be the rates for different time periods. So obviously during periods where there's a lot of energy use, just in general, for example, in the morning when people are preparing to go to work and get dressed and they're showering and they're cooking their meals, their breakfast, that's when you have a lot of energy demand. And during those periods of time, they would obviously have higher unit costs for energy to try and discourage use by other energy consumers. And then during off peak, that would be the optimal time when you would want to pump the system and try and augment the supply in the reservoirs. Next slide. So these wells are significantly very high pump producers. And because of that, and they're relatively close to each other, you're going to have what's called well interference effects. So as the wells pump, they're each going to create what's called cone of depressions that will overlap. And these cone of depressions are a measure of how much you've dropped the water level within the aquifer. The more you drop the water level, the more energy it requires to pull the water up from the well. So one of the types of models that we would develop would be a well field prediction model that would predict what will be the ground elevations at any given time at each of the different production wells to try and optimize around the energy costs. And it might use other surrogates. For example, we might measure the actual energy consumption they're using in kilowatt hours based on where the water levels are. And you can take those types of inputs into your neural network model and essentially learn to predict what the energy cost will be as a function of maybe weather conditions, pumping rates, the elevations within the aquifer at any given time. This becomes a very powerful tool to make accurate decisions with your pumping scheduling and also when to fill your reservoirs and how much to fill your reservoirs based on energy costs and needs and also what the demand is expected to be. Next slide. Now, forecasting water demand is a very important variable, obviously, because that's going to determine when and how much to pump your wells to a large extent. And that's obviously done with a function of weather conditions. There could be water use patterns that can help you understand what the demand might be into the future. So the farmers themselves, if they're using certain amounts of water, you might have the pattern that the neural network recognizes that during those water use patterns, they might use less water from the Mojave water system, and they might use more. The energy prices might also have an effect, obviously, on water demand. So the farmers, in trying to reduce their operational costs, they are going to be less likely to pump from the system when the energy costs are the highest. But again, if there's an extreme drought or they need to augment their water supply to provide the necessary, sustainability for their agricultural products, they're going to probably pump even when they don't necessarily want to. But the point is, we're going to try and use all this different information to make very accurate real-time water demand predictions. Next slide. This is probably, the takeaway from this whole presentation. So as Mike introduced in the very beginning, without good data, you cannot make meaningful predictions. We all know that from just everyday life, whether it's driving to work and knowing what the traffic patterns might be, or whether you're going to need some, extra food because you're having guests over. It's the same with complex hydrologic systems or water resources systems. You really have to understand your system, and you have to understand the type of data you will need to try and make the predictions that are meaningful for your system. And part of that also requires understanding the management objectives. So if you're trying to optimize energy costs, then obviously you're going to need information and data related to energy consumption. It could be unit costs for different wells. It could be what's demand requirement going to be at different points in time. And associated with those, you're going to have constraints on your system. And the process generally works where you work with a company like a kayaks that can help you develop a very robust data source system where you can assimilate, organize your data, then work with the kayaks, a company like NOAA. We can then work with the kayaks and with a client like Wesley, who understands the system extremely well, and develop a strategy for taking that data and developing meaningful prediction models. You would test those models with data, and then you would try and improve on them based on what the models are actually telling you. So, for example, one thing I didn't make clear enough is artificial neural networks also give you very powerful insights into your system. So there may be certain areas of your system, for example, that are particularly vulnerable to, let's say, a groundwater contamination plume that you may not have known otherwise. The neural network reveal that sensitivity based on the analysis of the data that you have historically. Or it might also tell you that certain parameters are more important than others. So we might find that maybe weather is very important for predicting water demand, obviously, but it might be soil moisture deficit within the area might be even more important. So neural networks can help you systematically improve not only your modeling capability, but your data collection capability. And that's an iterative process where you would work with the client or like an agency like Mojave or Malta. We're both critical to projects like this. With a company like Kayaks, it can help you optimize your data collection and storage. And you also want to be able to stream that data in real time to your models to be able to make those real time predictions. And over time, of course, as you gain more insights into the system, you gain more data, you have more experience operationally with your models, you can improve them over time. And as you collect more data, the neural networks will improve over time because they'll collect more data and get more knowledge of how the system behaves. I don't know if
Sorry, I mean, I advanced too fast.
Oh
Sorry.
no, that's fine. So that basically, so really, the major steps are this: you need good data, you need an understanding of your system, you need to develop your preliminary models and understand where they may be failing, where they may be performing well. You need to improve those models. You need to test them, validate them, and then ultimately deploy them and use them as a decision-making tool. And it takes a collaborative effort with the agency or the entities you're working with the data people, with the modeling people. You also need people to understand the physical system as well as the data, because the data itself, without understanding the physical system, you're not going to necessarily know how to use the data or what data to use. I cannot emphasize that enough. So, for example, I cannot make predictions with stocks because I'm not a stock. I'm not a financial expert. I wouldn't know necessarily what data to use. But as a hydrogeologist, I would hope that I can, at least in most cases, have a fairly good understanding of the data that we would need and how to make the predictions with the data that we have and how to supplement the data with additional data sources, instrumentation, etc. And Mike and someone like Wesley and Manuel will prove essential to that process because their understanding of the system cannot be understated. Next slide. And Mike, maybe you
So,
want to take?
yeah, so just to summarize, so we've seen three case studies of using artificial neural net, also called deep learning AI. And again, this is not, this is not chat GPT or this is not generative AI. This is a different branch along the sort of AI development tree, but it has proven benefits in groundwater management. We've looked at cases of energy cost optimization. We've looked at pollutant and saltwater transport minimization, pumping schedule optimization, and so forth. And so this is really quite real. Um, as Emery has described, you have to make sure the data preconditions are there. But once you have that, and once you have some expertise to make sure that the modeling is happening correctly, this is all very, very doable, basically, for any agency or any entity, any organization that is trying to manage groundwater. Emery described using AI models in conjunction with the mathematical optimization models so that you get kind of an even more powerful capability from that because you can use AI to model the system, but then you're using optimization to look at the exact optimal solutions basically within the overall solution space. As he emphasized, and as we talked about, careful data infrastructure preparation is very critical. And we also just want to point out that these techniques can be used in just about any other area outside of groundwater. So reverse osmosis desalination has many comparable kinds of challenges. Potable water distribution has many decision points about, the blending of the water, the pressure in different parts of the system, pumping schedules, I mean, on and on and on. Irrigation management has many similar types of trade-offs and complexities in terms of deciding across a relatively large area what the irrigation schedule should be, which water source to use, et cetera. So these techniques, we've talked about them as applied to groundwater, but they have many, many other applications in water as well. I'd like to just take this minute to thank the other presenters. Manuel, thank you very much. Wesley, thank you. It's quite early here in California, so thank you. And I know you have other things to tend to with your family, so thank you. And Emery, thank you as well. And with that, we have just about 10 minutes for some questions and answers. I'm not quite sure if the Zoom is going to allow us to use hand raising. Michaela, if so, please let us know if that would be the best protocol for asking a question. But otherwise, if any of you do have a question, please let us know and we'll do our best to answer it. And we do have about 10 minutes for that.
Yes. So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself, or you can use the raise hand function.
Thank you. I have a question just to kick things off. So, Manuel, from the work that Emery did, I guess what was the next phase within the Energy and Water Agency in terms of applying that to different things? And also one question that I've always wondered is what is the approximate electricity bill of your groundwater operations basically per year? I mean, what is the magnitude of the savings potentially that could be gained from this? Today, what is the overall electricity bill that the agency is confronted with from these operations?
Okay, so I think just to clarify one thing, the agency is a policy agency, so we're not into water production operations. That's the water utility. With them, we're testing AI and trying to see what is the, let's say, optimization potential. So as to have proof of a system which works, and then push for the utility to consider such tools which the utility is doing. So therefore, a first success would be that the concept of AI in water management was actually taken up by the utility. Then looking at the margins of optimization, so one needs to keep in mind that when we look at groundwater, so we're looking at groundwater abstraction, particularly from pumping stations, we're looking at 0.7, 0.8 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. So it depends on the pumping technology, depends on the depth. When we're looking at desalinated water, and I am including the abstraction from seawells, the desalination plant itself, and the transfer to reservoirs, we're talking of a consumption of something over 4 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. So there's always this almost 3.5 kilowatt hour per cubic meter, which can be a saving whenever groundwater can be used sustainably instead of desalination in certain periods. Obviously, it's not just a question of volume, it's also a question of arriving to the optimal quality scenario as well. But yes, there are savings which can be made. The savings, I'm quoting kilowatt hours per cubic meter because the price of the kilowatt hour per cubic meter varies according to the country and how energy prices are worked in different countries. But definitely a potential saving is there, and the higher the price of energy, the higher the margin for saving which there is.
Thank you. And in the attendees, any questions from any of the attendees? As Michaela said, you can raise your hand within Zoom, or you can just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
There was a question in chat.
Yes,
Mike.
I saw that question. Right.
Oh, thank
So
you.
the question was, how many years of data do you need to develop a robust, I'm assuming, neural network model? It really depends on the system. So if it's a highly complex system that's, very dynamic and there's a lot of, a lot of variation in the operations of it. I mean, ideally, you want as much data as possible, but we've seen that we can develop pretty accurate models with a few years of data. So, for example, with the Malta case, that saltwater upconing problem with that galley, which is a very complicated problem, I can assure you no numerical model would come close to touching that. We only had 5 years of monthly data, so it was only about 60 events that we could train the model with, but still it did exceptionally well when it validated. Um, so it really just depends on the nature of the system. But the thing with groundwater systems that's good is that they're not complex in the way they behave. So, for example, if you pump more, your water levels will drop more, right? If you have more rainfall, generally your water levels will recover more. So it's not like you have a very chaotic, random system where you have very bizarre behavior. The question probably becomes more if you've been collecting the data you need to collect to make the predictions you want to predict. And a lot of times, as Mike pointed out, a lot of times the data simply is not there. You have to work with the entity to try and implement a system, a monitoring data collection system will provide the data necessary. But under ideal conditions, if you have maybe 2 or 3 years of data, depending on how much frequently the data was collected, et cetera, you can make pretty meaningful predictions.
Great. Any other questions from the attendees? That was a great question. Thank you for that, Wesley.
I'd like to say just real quickly that when we started 20 years ago, many people were not really interested in the technology. They were very skeptical. Like I said, Manuel was an exception, but we have worked in some very interesting places. I mean, China was very receptive to it. They were actually the first country that ever contacted NOAA in regard to some of the problems they were having. We worked in Asia, South Korea, the Philippines, Europe, but it's becoming a very accepted tool, not just in what like ChatGPT, like more mainstream, but other sectors, industries are starting to adopt it. And I think water is finally moving that direction. But it's going to take people like Manuel and Wesley with these large agencies that have a lot of reputation and have a lot of need for better decision making to bring AI, I think, more to the forefront within our industry.
Maybe to just add into that, we within the California groundwater community and within the California water community overall, our company at Kayaks does a lot of work with different agencies, and I think that there's a general awareness of the need to get the data house in order and to begin to invest in the data infrastructure for the different utilities, basically. So we see a lot of utilities that are beginning to understand that they have to begin a series of successive investments in different data projects that can be used then as the basis for the infrastructure for this. The funding for that can become challenging in the U.S. There has historically been grant money provided from the federal government that goes down to the states and then can be used by the states to distribute to utilities who apply for grants. There have not been many programs specifically for data infrastructure preparation, but I get the sense that that is a possibility over the next 5 to 10 years that there will be grant programs evolving specifically for that because the need is so great to help take the data. Some utilities have years of data. Some utilities have a lot less regarding pumping, for example. Many areas of California, they only began really measuring and keeping records of pumping within the last few years. And so there isn't a long history of pumping records in those areas. But as we have just heard, that can be sufficient, depending on the situation, that even that can be sufficient to be able to begin to approach these things. We have just a minute left. Any other final call for quick questions out from the audience? Anybody else have a question? It seems like not. Well, we would just like to say thank you very much for joining us. We're quite honored to have the attendees for this session. And if you have any questions, please go ahead. You can contact any one of us. I should have had a slide with all the contact information, so I apologize that we don't have that, but you could, my email is quite simple. It's mike@aqaix.com, mike@kayaks.com. You could email me and I'm happy to forward on to any of the panelists basically, but you might be able to find their email contacts through the digital platform as well. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to be adjourning now. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your time at World Water Week and a set of productive sessions. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.